Jillian Richards has been part of the RDI team since 2013 with a rural background, raised and educated in the UK. She's got a BSc and a PhD in material science and engineering. She's worked on various projects since joining the RDI team, but my connection to her began with her work around food processing and innovation, including being lead for the Food and Beverage Processing Industry Growth to Pathway 2020 project. She also drew my attention around another RDI project, the 101 Ideas for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which featured a number of interesting and inspired Manitoba processors. Today, she's speaking to us about 2 case studies examined as part of the Rural Innovation in Manitoba project, reducing barriers to commercialization and growing capacity in the agri-food sector. I'm delighted to hear what you have to say, Jillian. Go ahead.
So, as Alana mentioned, this is part of the RIM project, which is funded by Going Forward too. I just mentioned that this presentation and the webinar is our work, and it's not reflective of the opinions of the Government of Manitoba or Canada. We have some partner organizations, as you can see. They are mostly organizations that support innovators and entrepreneurs. We've done a number of things in this case study. We've done an inventory of supports in Manitoba. We've looked at innovation centers. We've also done a rural survey and consultations. Today we'll be talking about case studies that we did. We did 5 case studies, and we've picked 2 to talk about in detail. The other 3 are available on the website, and you can see the URL there, and this PowerPoint will be available, so you can just click on it then. The results that we've got from these 2 cases that I'll be talking about today are actually consistent with all the other research we've done, including some of the stuff that Alana mentioned as well. We've done 9 other case studies of food producers in Manitoba, and the results we've got here are all consistent with all that previous research. So in the case studies, we talked to company leaders and 5 people or organizations that helped each of these companies commercialize, and we call these people stakeholders, for want of a better word. And today we're looking at 2 case studies, Crik Nutrition and Canadian Birch Company. I'm just going to digress just a tiny bit. So just to talk a little bit about case studies and why we do them. They're a very good way of showing how a process works, telling a story in an accessible way. And they shed light on the key components of what's going on during commercialization, compare similarities and differences across companies. Here we've showed what supports were used and how they were used. And that links to showing how the support system might be strengthened. Another question, which is, you think, a simple one, but not necessarily, is what do we mean by commercialization? So I hit Google, and I basically got 2 answers to that question. Some people said it's when you're making money out of something, and other people said it's when you have a product and you introduce it to the market. Once you've introduced it to the market, you've commercialized it. We're leaning towards the first definition, in that the commercialization doesn't actually finish when you introduce. You actually need to be at least moving solidly towards making a profit. So after that digression, we'll go back to the Canadian Birch Company. So Glenda and Rory Hart are the movers and shakers behind the Canadian Birch Company, and the actual product that we focused on monitoring the commercialization of is their amber gold birch syrup. It's the one in the middle of that picture there, and the one on the right in those 3. They have a few other products, including a couple of jams and sauces, and 3 types of syrup that from different times that you take the syrup, early, middle, and late. And they have trees, and they go from getting the sap out of trees all the way to the syrup in the bottle. So who helped them? So we interviewed 5 stakeholders. There were other people who helped them, obviously, and but we just picked 5, or in fact they picked 5, just because we can't interview everybody. So first is a family member, Alan, who's helped them all along the way in a myriad of different ways. He has a background in engineering and business, which was very useful. Forestry training services, Ken knows an awful lot about trees and an awful lot about syrup and how to make, how to tap and to make syrup. Food Development Center in Portage, we interviewed 2 people from there, and they helped in a lot of different ways in terms of getting the product out. Women's Enterprise Center is helped with money and with business advice, and Package Designs is a company that specializes in some ways in food, designing food packages and packaging and branding. So you can see that's quite a range of different things. So yeah, there we go. And there were multiple others, including especially equipment suppliers. So we looked at the commercialization in terms of 6 steps. That you can see them there: planning, finance, product process development. I'll say PPD for short sometimes. Scaling up everything, promotion and marketing, and sustaining and growing. So you've got color coding going on here. And on the right, we have a simplified timeline. So going down with time, and you can see that they went in a stepwise way. So they had the idea, did some research, planning, actually make some syrup, and going down there. So they kind of did it in a stepwise way. And from the original idea to start a business with birch trees to when we did the interviews is 10 years. So that's a significant length of time. So now I'm just going to scoot through this quickly and tell the story. After a few years of doing a lot of research, Glenda and Rory, that's why they're black there, because they've really worked hard and did most of the work at this stage. They involved Alan early on, and you'll see there's kind of color coding going on with people's names, and that indicates that they're involved in a couple of things. So blue was research and ideas, and green was actually planning and finance for Alan. And so it took roughly 4 years, maybe about, until they decided to go with birch, to try birch syrup, tapped some trees, made some syrup the old-fashioned way. So 2010, they decided, okay, we're going to go for this, but we're not going to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to do it in a bit more volume. So had to look for funding, incorporated, tapped some more trees, bought some equipment, and went to the FTC and sorted out food safety. Even by 2013, they'd made some product and were developing recipes and actually had their own facility with equipment in it, which actually is quite quick to do that. And they were even winning awards by 2013. And you can see on the right, Alan was involved in everything, Ken at the beginning, FTC with quite a lot, and Sandy was even stepping in with branding. And Weckham was, Women's Enterprise Center, was helping them with applications and business planning around 2013. The equipment they got was quite extensive. You'll see that little list under the product process development. That's all the different types of equipment that they now have in their facility. So that's quite a lot of equipment to learn how to use and perfect the process. And that was done in 2014. They really got a handle on it, and they had sparkle. That their amber gold syrup was really just came out really clear and sharp, and they nailed the process. The big purchase they made in 2014 was the vacuum system, a new system for harvesting, for collecting the syrup that was far more efficient. And you can see they're moving to value add. And they're also, as time progressed, they're obviously, as they make syrup, they have to sell it. And they're also making value added products. Now you see I put a little purple box around the Birch bacon jam. That's a product they have, which is very popular. The only problem they have is that at the moment the only place they can make it is in a commercial kitchen, which is good that they can make it there and sell it, but it's also not so good because the efficiency and the volume they can make it in is not as much as they would like. And also it's not a federally inspected facility, so they can't export it. So that's kind of holding them back a little bit there. So I think that is pretty much the story for Canadian Birch. And I'm actually not doing too bad with time. So took them 10 years. They made a stepwise progression through commercialization. Took them roughly 4 years from getting the idea to get the money and the equipment and actually sort the process out. And it's not surprising because they're doing an awful lot. They're the whole supply chain themselves. They're not involving anybody else. And they've also made value-added products. So now I'm going to take a little break. And Alana's going to talk to you for a second. There we go.
Thanks, Gillian. I just noticed I wanted to bring people's attention back. There's no questions that have popped up yet. People are more than welcome to type questions as we're moving along, and we'll hold them until the end of Gillian's presentation, and I'll say a few words at the conclusion about some work that I'm involved with here at the center. But I wanted to draw your attention when you're looking at the next profile, Crik Nutrition. The commercialization steps, as Gillian has gone through them, are identified in those 6 step process: the idea, research, planning and finance, product and process development, scaling up, promotion, and then sustaining and growing. And that when we're looking at the timeline for these 2 organizations, there's significant difference in how they've approached the commercialization process, both in how long it took, but also it's important to note, and I'm not sure whether you said this or not, Gillian, because I had a little bit of cutout as I was listening to you, is that oftentimes those steps are simultaneous. So they're not doing just one thing at a time, but it's across the board, and they're sort of diving into certain steps at the same time as running ahead in other areas as well. So
yeah, so thanks, Alana. Yes, I didn't mention that specifically, and it definitely bears mentioning because essentially when you look at those graphs, they don't stop. You start, but you never stop doing market research. You never stop improving your business skills, etc., etc. And eventually you're doing everything at once. So, which is kind of what Alex does with Crik. So this is Alex. You get a picture of him, and his product and company is protein powder, but based on the main source of protein in his protein powder is crickets. So his idea came from wanting the product and not being able to find it, and also wanting to start a new business. And the base of what he's, the driving force behind the company is actually just sustainability and the fact that crickets are a really good source of protein. And people should probably be eating insects more than they are. Well, not everybody fancies it, but they're a very good source. So talking about his story again, the stakeholders we interviewed in this case were Intimo Farms. That's a business in Ontario that farms crickets. So they formed a partnership essentially, not an official part one, but they definitely work together with Crik to help promote the use of crickets. GFL Pharma, who are a company that actually processes and makes the protein powders for a number of different companies. Futurepreneur, another entrepreneurial support agency, as is North Forge, as is Women's Enterprise Centres from before. And last but not least, Source Nutraceutical. They're based out of Winnipeg, and they help companies export, and they'll also help people distribute, so in terms of the paperwork and in terms of the logistics. And of course, others. Definitely other people involved with helping Alex and Crik go through commercialization. And as Alana mentioned, this is that same graph again. We'll talk a little bit later and compare the two, but you can definitely see that he hit the ground running. And that's partly because of the way he decided to do things. He doesn't have his own processing facility. He uses co-processing. But it's also partly because he has business experience. He had, as you see, one of his first steps was to close his other business. So he didn't have to learn that. And also he had a very deep knowledge of how to market on the web, which he got recently too. So you'll see here that he's, as I say, hit the ground running. He, as soon as he could find somebody that would work with him as a manufacturer, he found a source. He was all about getting some money and getting it out there. So now we'll just do the same and just run through his process in a bit more detail. So Jared was involved right at the beginning. Obviously, you need to supply crickets if you're going to make cricket protein powder. But he's also helped with the planning and the financing at the early stages. And at an early stage too, Alex met Joelle from Futurepreneur, and he also did crowdfunding to raise money, and got a little bit of press. And through that scaling up and product process, through this this time, oh yes, I forgot to mention the time. The time here at scale is a little different. We had 10 years in that whole graph. Here we've got 2 for this. So each of these squares is roughly 3 months. This isn't precise, but roughly 3 months. In the other Canadian Birch graphic, where each of the squares was a year. So things are moving a lot faster here. He used crowdfunding, Indiegogo, to get some money, got people to order protein powder before he'd even made any. So that's quite an interesting way of getting money, and talk to North Forge too. So moving along a little bit now, Futurepreneur linked him to the Spin Masters competition, and he got gained a lot from that. He got $50,000, essentially won, plus a lot of mentorship and assistance from various people. So that helped him along, and by late 2015, they sorted out the formulation for the protein powder, made the first order, and shipped it. So that's pretty fast. And Source helped them with the third-party regulator, the fulfillment, all the logistics, and the actual shipping of his product. And as you can see, he's also got the promotion and marketing is through web-based a lot of the time, and also through press coverage. And as we carry on, Global Entrepreneurs. He again got recognized as one of the top 50 startups in the world, which is pretty incredible. That's the Startup Open. And again, GFR was helping him all along the way in many different ways. So was Jared, Joelle, and North Forge with the mentoring and business advice, and Source Nutraceutical again, involved in product process development, as well as the actual distribution. Oh, and of course, Shopify website is definitely very important. He's essentially a web-based company. We could have put that in all sorts of places. Definitely could go in promotion and marketing, and actually scaling up to commercial too. That's one of the issues with trying to categorize things, is some things actually fit in many different places. You'll see that by 2016, he actually had made a second flavor of protein powder, chocolate, and had actually, just when we interviewed him, just had the second one, second lot of protein powder delivered. So that's a sort of a snapshot there. So you'll see that he's done things very differently. Less than 2 years from idea to sales, doing everything at once, essentially, almost from the beginning all the way, definitely almost selling it before he'd made it, because he had so much help in terms of not having to buy equipment or anything like that. He could move a lot faster because he used contract manufacturing and packing and distribution, in fact. So there we go. Alana's turn again.
Thanks, Gillian. I'm going to comment on a question that has come through because it's a really central one to some of the work that you do, and certainly the work that we do here at the Women's Enterprise Center. The question was, in terms of introducing to different support agencies, did these agencies work together to support the company? And I'm aware that of the many business development professionals who are working through Manitoba Ag at the Development Institute and at the Food Processing Center, oftentimes, and other support agencies. We do work collaboratively with a client when we know that they have a need or they need support in a very specific area. So pointing them in the direction of someone who's got that skill set certainly makes a big difference. And it looks like Crik utilized all manner of expertise in accelerating that production and process timeline for him.
Yes, I would say the answer to that.
There was one other question that maybe you can comment on. You're going to go into implications and commonalities, but the question was asked, how much company, did you do research, and is there information on how much money was invested by the company and how much support was provided through government means and how they accessed it?
Sort of is the answer to that. We didn't ask direct questions as to how much money you got from here, largely because a lot of companies don't want to share that sort of specific information. So no, we didn't get that real huge actual numbers there. But there certainly is a role for government. And as you can see, there's a role, like Futurepreneur is an NGO, which is allied to the federal government. So is Women's Enterprise Center. He also, Alex also went to Innovate Manitoba boot camp or some training. So there was using a lot of money. One of the interesting things about Alex was that he got money from unusual sources in crowdfunding and the Spin Masters, whereas Canadian Birch had some money from RD. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but that's a program that doesn't exist anymore. But that was definitely a government program. And through WECM too, which is not really government, but yeah. So the answer is no, we didn't track that. And tracking back to the first one, I will talk a little bit about this later. Yes, there is some interaction between the support agencies. I'm sure if, we didn't track that specifically, but most of the agencies especially referred to networking and referring to other agencies. Certainly the financial agencies know about the Food Development Center and vice versa, and they will refer back and forth. Is there any room for improvement in that system? Perhaps, but it definitely does happen. And the idea of networking and mentoring came through loud and clear, and as being very important through all 5 case studies, in fact. So I think I'll just skip on to the next section, and I'll remind everybody, type in some questions to Alana if you have any as we go through here, because we'll be dealing with them at the end. So similarities and differences. Products look quite different, that's for sure. So similarities, just a few of them. You can probably think of more. They both have innovative ingredients. Not many people make birch syrup, and not many people make protein powder out of crickets. I don't think very many at all in the world. They both used multiple resources to help them commercialize. They weren't doing this in a vacuum. They both used outside funding from different sorts of sources, but they both used outside funding through the commercialization process. Both of them started with little experience of the food industry. Alex had experience of business, but it was a learning curve for him to learn how the food industry worked. And although there were differences in their process of commercialization and different emphasis on different stages, both of them, in fact, all 5 cases, went through each of those stages. They all had to research their idea and do market research. They all had to develop a product and a process to make it. Even if they actually weren't doing it in-house, that process still took development. And so on through scaling up, making enough processed product to sell, etc. And they both faced the challenge of ensuring that everything grew in sync, so that they weren't making too much product and not being able to sell it, or having people who wanted to buy their product and not being able to make enough. And they both, and in fact most of the studies mentioned that as a challenge, to try and grow in a balanced way. So here I just put the 2 charts side by side so you can really see the difference in how things happened. Even if you take off that thinking time at the beginning for Canadian birch, there's still a distinct difference between these 2 paths. And obviously a very big difference in the timeline here. And so the speed is very different. We've called the one on the left a stepwise process, so they're not really promoting and marketing to any huge extent before they have any product. That's the case in Canadian birch. But with Crik, he's off and running 6 months after. He's doing crowdfunding. He's trying to get people to commit to buy his product, even before he's actually finished perfecting the product. And that worked because he managed to do his first order like that. The really big difference is in terms of whether the Canadian birch has their own facility. They've got the building, the equipment in there, 5 different sorts of equipment that they have to deal with in terms of their process and their harvesting. Whereas Crik has contracted the manufacturer, the product process development, and the distribution out to others. And his main focus is to be the guiding force behind the product, and he has control over what the product is, and he's the marketer. He's the one who sells. So so that's it, and that is reflected in the fact that Canadian birch is the supply chain. They do everything. And Crik Nutrition is that essentially developed themselves a value chain. So he's working very closely with his supplier and his producer and his manufacturer, and in fact his customers, either directly through the internet or he is developing some retail too, I believe. And another difference was the level of business experience that they came into this with. So they needed different support. Canadian Birch didn't come into this with a great deal of business experience, although they had assistance from family that did have that. But Crik came into there experienced in business, though not in food business. So going on, for both, we've got different sorts of stakeholders. In fact, for all 5 cases we looked at in this study. We've got NGOs and government, direct government like Manitoba Agriculture, and we've got commercial like Sandra and things like that. We've also got individuals and organizations that are closely associated with the company or supply chain. Canadian Birch wasn't the only one that identified somebody that was very close. Other people identified actually employees as stakeholders. And supply chain members, again, were very important. I think every single one of the 5 identified somebody within the supply chain as a stakeholder. And they often provide very specialized services. The Food Development Center is product process development and helping with labeling and food safety. The other ones like the business advice and funding was definitely that's the speciality of Women's Enterprise Center, Futurepreneur, North Forge. And of course, branding is a very specific thing, but that can involve lots of things. It was Sandra was involved with branding, with designing the label, with helping with displays for shows. So although the stakeholders provide help in a specific way, we also found that they also sort of spread out and were involved with many aspects of commercialization. So they had a primary role and a secondary role, and this is where it comes to networking and also acting as a sounding board for bouncing ideas off or just general support when going gets tough. That was a role a lot of the stakeholders identified and the innovators. So now I just want to this comes out partly out of our this research, but it also came out of previous research that we've done, is that, in fact, this statement comes out of previous research, but it's applicable here. Food processors, in order to be competitive, they need to reliably provide a consistent, high-quality product in the quantity the customer wants, delivered when they want it, and at a competitive price. So if you miss any of those out, this was out of the bulk study, so you're dealing with a company rather than an individual, but same thing applies. If you miss any of those out, you failed. You're going to lose your customer. So that's one thing that when you're commercializing, you've got to consider all those things. You've got to be reliable, quality, quantity, delivering on time, and of course, the real sticker, a competitive price. So as people are working through, this is a sort of a modified version of our idea of how we were looking at progress through the commercialization. Often you'll start with an idea and research. You'll have to make your product. Actually, I'm going to go back a little bit and say product process development don't think that this means that just because idea and research finishes at the beginning, that it doesn't carry on the whole time, because it does. The same with product process development. Product process development doesn't ever really stop. You get a good product, but you can always make it a little tiny bit better or a little tiny bit different for a different customer. So, and then we got planning, market research, getting money, and networking and getting mentoring happens all the way through. And this is all to go to this goal of commercialization. And then scaling up is scaling up a lot of things. And this goes back to this balance idea, that you have to balance all these 5 and probably more aspects of scaling up your production and your capacity in many different ways. So you have to have your supply correct, you have to have your production, you can make the right amount of material at the right price, you have to do sales, you have to distribute. As you grow, you might have to hire more people, and you're definitely developing relationships with customers and with suppliers and everybody else. And you also have to make sure your business knowledge is keeping up with the scale that you're working at now. So all those things you have to build up together. And then eventually, once you get to a certain point, probably when you're making money or maybe not, you're flipping and you can say, yeah, I kind of commercialized this. I'm selling it, I'm making some money. So that's how another way of representing this commercialization process. So kind of winding up here a little bit. The question is, when does commercialization end? When do you move beyond your low volume sales to actually commercialize? So from what we've seen talking to these people and others, you haven't finished commercialization when you've actually produced your first product. So Alex hadn't finished when he made his first lot of powder. He needs to build his different varieties, and he needs to build his volume and his sales. And certainly Canadian Birch hadn't finished commercialization when they produced their first syrup. They hadn't even perfected their process at that point, and they certainly hadn't got the value add that they need to make their company actually work in terms of volume of sales. Excuse me. And sort of allied with that is that support for innovators and companies needs to continue beyond product launch. They need help with scaling up, especially with production and commercial efficiencies and branding and sales. They're through the 5 case studies and through these 2, the stakeholders drew on their experience not only of our 5 case studies, but with their other clients, and said that there was a gap, that there's a problem with helping people go from a prototype or low volume to get to the size they want to be. And there was also a gap identified in terms of helping with branding and sales. There's some help, but not enough, and even operating capital, but I'll get to that. One size does not fit all. You can see from these 2 examples, which I did choose because they're different, but as you'll see if you look at all 5 case studies, all 5 case studies are different. They've gone about things very differently and have very different products and very different situations and skills. So the aims, the skills that the innovator comes in with, and the needs all affect what support needs to be provided. And as Alana referred to earlier, they need to support and guide the innovators to the specialized supports they need. Now in Manitoba, most of those supports are there. The innovators don't necessarily know where they are, and perhaps there's some supports that aren't there that would be useful. So we go to the biggest challenges. So as I said, the companies need to build their capacity. So they need to grow in a balanced way, growing all these different aspects: supply, business skills, production, sales, so that they grow in a balanced way. And they have to find funding, which is often a challenge. Not very easy at all to do that. And this was, I think, an important result that came out of these studies, is that although Crik is the exception that proves the rule, generally speaking, food companies develop slower. And it's often linked to setting up a facility or having their own equipment. And for many, that's essential because they don't have a choice. Crik had the opportunity. He's gone out of province, but he can manufacture his product elsewhere with a heavier product, and for some products it's just not practical. There is nowhere where they can co-manufacture or contract manufacture. So often companies have to invest in equipment, and it's expensive and it takes money, and you have a big jump to go from a small sales to large enough sales to make buying the equipment justifiable. And sometimes that's just too big a jump for companies to make. And the other challenge for food companies is the shelf stocking issue, is that it's not easy to get into retail stores. There are ways, there are some improvements there, but it's still not easy to build sales in the food industry. And consequently, food companies will tend to develop slower than the average company, the average startup. So I think that is, and I've talked about the jumping the gap already. So I think that is pretty much it. I would like to thank you for listening. And also, I would also like to thank all the companies and the stakeholders that participated in the case studies, because it does take time, and they were very helpful in taking us along with our research. So it's over to Alana now, who's going to give us a few more thoughts from her point of view as somebody who is a business advisor and has also also doing some research into food processing and the food processing industry in Manitoba, which is somewhat aligned with our research, though coincidentally. So take it away, Alana.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gillian. Just a bit of a background. We started after a roundtable discussion with some of our other service providers. Manitoba Agriculture was at the table, representation from Community Futures and Entrepreneurship Manitoba. We were talking about the supports to processors and individuals who are in the farmers market sort of arena, and that we see an awful lot of women participating in that market, but not an awful lot of women going through full-scale commercialization. And we wanted to know what the issue was, or what the gaps or what the challenges were that were specific to women. We applied for and got funding through Status of Women Canada, but the research that we're doing is not exclusive. We really wanted to look at that full cross-section between men and women who are participating in the sector. And we just, yesterday, I think, we closed off our survey and got 111 processors commenting on what some of their features were. Now, Manitoba Ag and your research, there's some wonderful similarities between some of the results and outcomes. I haven't done all the analysis, but we also took the approach that the work that you have done through the many projects that the RDI has been doing in the last 3-4 years, that 2020 project, I think, was capped off in 2014. we didn't want to ask the same questions. We wanted to dig a little deeper and understand what were some of the real issues facing people in terms of accessing the right kinds of supports at the right stage in their business development, and really aligning what were some of the missing pieces and how could we help processors get through the myriad of hoops that they have to get through to get from that point of idea to producing at larger quantity and scaling up for wealth creation. Someone has asked earlier on whether or not you investigated the business structure, because that probably has implication on how their commercialization, full commercialization process, how effective it was, and if there were changes over time. I think that's a really key piece. And I know that you've got summaries on the RDI website of all the processors and profiles that you've done, the 5 of them. And I believe you do identify some of that business structure, but that was a key piece of the research that we've undertaken, so that we'd know exactly where they were, whether they're incorporated, what the partnership level looks like, and the kinds of support they've gotten all along. Someone else has asked the question specifically about the legal processes to protect intellectual property processes and recipes. So we're curious whether or not that was actually a part of your discovery with some of your profiles. I expect that it was. I'm not sure how you may have addressed some of the challenges that your processors experienced. And another individual here has asked whether or not you looked at the innovator's image of the roles of the supports that they received over time and as things progressed. Was their expectation met, and how did they adjust their expectations of the individuals and organizations that were supporting them? I think that's an excellent question, and it certainly was a significant part of the line of inquiry that we're taking in our C3 project, because it is a continuum along which clients come to us, and it really needs to mirror what you've talked about, Gillian, the balance of finding the right supports for clients at the right time with the right tools and expertise, mentoring all along, and keeping that network of individuals aligned, so that, you know, there's a lot of, you know, run forward 3 steps, fall back 2, and you're grappling to pick up the pieces, and, you know, that individual who knew exactly what you needed, but it was 6 months too early. You know, trying to manage that kind of process in terms of the commercialization journey can be quite overwhelming. So that would be an excellent thing for you to comment on. My colleague Nancy also had an excellent question, whether or not you can comment on, from that introduction that you gave us about the definition of commercialization. It doesn't end when the product is being sold, but there is a relationship to profitability. And I think as a business advisor and as an agency that supports women and women partnered with men in business, the metrics that we use to evaluate the business likelihood of someone who comes with a fabulous idea, so much depends on your ability to pay yourself, and pay yourself a reasonable living wage. The food business is entirely different than many of our other entrepreneurs, because you have to take the long view of, there are years and years and monies invested in your business even before. You might be making sales, but you're barely covering the costs of production, never mind having all your own equipment or the facility appropriate to your specific product. So that piece of profitability, and whether or not you're meeting the expectations of your funder, is a huge challenge, and one that we've got to find, I think, alternative approaches and perspective in terms of our real support of these people. So maybe you can answer a couple of those questions, Gillian, and we'll keep moving forward from that.
Yeah, well, actually, that was a lot of questions. So how about you just fire one of them at me, so I can maybe address the last one, because that was the one I can remember, So I think you're right. I think the a lot of the businesses that we've talked with, and when we hit a similar thing when we did the survey, a rural survey of entrepreneurs, getting money from banks or conventional lenders was not working so well for them. And they needed somebody who really understood the food business. And it may be something to do, it's really looking at the aims of the person and what they're trying to do and whether they'll be able to pay back the loan, rather than perhaps whether they can pay themselves in the short term. So I think that's maybe one of the things that needs to be looked at. I would say I agree with you there. What was one of the other questions? If you could just perhaps restate one of them.
Processes to protecting intellectual property, recipes.
Yeah, we didn't really ask about that a great deal, and people did not share that they'd patented things. I think a lot of time the patenting process is a very onerous one, and it's an expensive one, and the stage that most of our people that we're talking to are at, they really don't have the money to go through that. And there's a slight glitch with patenting too, is that if you patent something, you're making it public. And that is not necessarily what people want to do either. If you want to, if somebody makes it and uses your patent, they're supposed to pay you, but you got to sue them in order to get the money. So I would say that patenting is not something that's on the radar of a lot of these businesses. They'll just obviously have confidentiality agreements with people like the Food Development Center or whoever they're developing their product with. And I think that's kind of the way they handle that. You have frozen, Alana. Are you still there? Okay. Hopefully people can hear me. We were also looking at the changes over time, and we didn't have really, we were looking at people who are at the beginning of their journey, although 10 years in doesn't sound like the beginning, but for two of our case studies, that was the case. I think that speaks to the fact that food processing can be a slow business, a slow build business. But if you do it right, that it can continue, and that you just because you're slow doesn't mean to say you're doing anything wrong. I think there are perhaps ways that the support system can help speed things up by providing money to the right people at the right time, or the support at the right time. And yeah, the notion, I think touched on it a little bit with Canadian Birch, in that they were certainly, their company structure, it's hard, they're still fairly small. There's just a couple running the company, and they're employing people to help sell and to help harvest. And so the company structure isn't changing, but their skills have to change. And if they grow bigger, then their skills will have to change more. And that's, I can even go to one of our other case studies with Floating Leaf. They're an established company. The company's been around for decades, over 80 years, I believe. So their business skills, they're not building business skills. They have the business skills and they have the sales skills, but they needed help. They've got a new product, they developed it, and they sold it, but it was that capital investment that was where they needed help and got it. So that was another case of different companies needing different help. And and handling things in different ways. And now, and they're probably exporting more now they have the different product, so that makes a difference too. So any of the other questions? The image of roles, I jotted down here. So you're referring to the image that the entrepreneur or the innovator
it was the idea of how the entrepreneurs and the innovators viewed the supports that were available to them as their projects progressed. Was there a change in how the service providers, that role shifted through the course of
that is interesting. Yes, we didn't ask a specific question about that. We just kind of asked, what were the milestones and who helped you over those milestones, and who can we talk to? So no, we didn't ask specifically about that. So I'll be very interested to see what your results show. That if they, yeah, I would say there's definitely a change in that relationships are developed. So I think we hit partly that in that. Let me think of an example from these case studies. Well, your example, actually, Wickham maybe even. Initially, I believe that the Canadian Birch, I don't know exactly how it happened, contacted Wickham because they needed some more money because they wanted to improve their harvesting system. So, but that's often with Wickham and most agencies that are giving money, it's okay, so what are you doing? Are you planning right? How can we help you with your business skills? So that's all linked in there. So they might have gone for money, but they got value add on that money. And so that's, and that development of the process, that relationship changes over time, and they've got a question about something and they think you can help, they'll go and they'll ask it. And that's the case with most of the stakeholders that we've got here. If they have a question, if they have a problem with their trees, they'll go to Ken and they'll say, what's happening here? Mm-hmm. So that continuing relationship, that changes, but it can come back. And I think having a relationship with multiple mentors and experts is a really common theme that came out through all 5 case studies that was very, very important. So, yeah, I think that addresses that in some ways. Do we have any more questions there? Has anybody been typing in?
We've got a couple of comments, but we're experiencing a fair degree of internet instability, I'll call it that. So you're cutting out a bit, but I think that you made the point that connectivity of entrepreneurs to their support systems and the various service agencies that have something to offer. That piece came through loud and clear in the 2 consultation events that you organized, and where we feel that we have a good understanding of what the needs are, and that we as service providers are transparent in what it is that we offer, and think that people know that we exist and can come to us. I think there's gaps even amongst us as providers to better articulate how we can work together and partner. Mm-hmm. And you started with that idea of futurepreneur and the kind of lending and support that they can offer to innovators and entrepreneurs right at the onset of a great idea. And then that rolls into something else that might be with Louis Riel Capital Corp or ourselves or a community future organization, which then rolls into those larger scale private investments. Crik looking for crowdfunding to get the project to that next step. And it's really central that we need to find a way to leverage all of that data, that information, and make sure that our clients have access to it handily as they go through the journey. So one other question that surfaced was the inquiry, your research very specifically, you're the Rural Development Institute, and you were looking at the Rural Entrepreneur and Innovation. Was there some discussion about urban processors or folks who are closer to urban centers, and if there was any difference in the studies that you had of those people who had a little greater access to some support? Or
as it turned out, we tried to get rural, sort of really rural, as in more than 200 kilometers from either Brandon or even 100 kilometers from even Brandon or Winnipeg or say Portage. There's quite a lot of food processing around Portage. So we were actually not successful in having anybody that was more than 50 kilometers from either Portage or Winnipeg. So we didn't get a massive take on that effect. I will say, and I'm pretty sure that Glenda won't mind me sharing this, that she mentioned to me when I called her about attending this webinar, and she said, well, I'll have to drive into Winnipeg because my internet's not good enough to do that where we live. And they just live like no more than 50, 70 kilometers north of Winnipeg. So that's certainly an issue. And our Southwest survey, although it wasn't the food processors specifically, brought up a number of rural issues that I'm sure will affect rural food processors. The distance, the fact that they are a long distance from a decent size of market is a challenge. Internet is a challenge. Sometimes road and rail access is a challenge. And also a big challenge that didn't actually come out from the case studies at all is labor. So finding skilled labor that's available rurally. And I'm sure that some of these challenges are also applied to the urban situation. And of course, access to services, you know, if you're close to Winnipeg, it's easy to go to a workshop. If you're in the PAR or Melita, it's not so easy to go to the workshop. So, you know, there's some stuff available online, but that business support and the specialized support is not so easy to access if you're rural. So I think we are over our time, which doesn't surprise me totally, but only 5 minutes. So how are we doing with any more questions? Any more?
There's no more questions online. There's a few people who are going to access the resources on the RDI website, which I strongly encourage them to do because they're excellent summaries of the work that you've been doing. And I just wanted to say to you, Jillian, thank you very much. Your research and the work that Manitoba Ag is currently doing, I understand that they're at the tail end of their own survey about gaps and how they can improve policy and supports to their constituents. It really makes a huge difference, and I'm eager to share the results of our research with you and sort of make a plan moving forward. I'm hopeful and optimistic.
Yes, I'm hopeful that we can build on it too. And I'll mention that link that I put at the beginning of the webinar. That takes you to the case study reports, all 5 of them, and I believe they're quite accessible and readable, so anybody can read that. And if you read I could only go into sort of a quick gloss over. They're only a few pages long anyway. They're worth reading, and soon. We will have some more reports coming up there. We're coming to the end of this research. So we've got a multi-case report that's going to be up there doing more comparisons between the 5 case studies we did. And we've also got a report on the survey we did of businesses in Southwest Manitoba. So watch that space, and there'll be announcements and stuff. So that'll be coming out too for anybody else who's interested in more detail on our research.
That's wonderful. And anybody who's interested in hearing more about ours, I invite you to connect with me as well, and we'll keep the dialogue going. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you, and thanks everybody. So I think I've got another slide